Margaret Chen wiped down the marble surface of the grand piano for the third time that evening. The October charity gala was in full swing at the Whitmore estate, and wealthy guests moved through the mansion like colorful butterflies, their expensive jewelry catching the light from the crystal chandeliers. She had learned to move quietly around these people over the past 3 years, becoming almost invisible as she worked. The massive Steinway concert grand piano dominated the main hall like a sleeping giant. Its black surface reflected the golden light perfectly, and Margaret couldn't help but admire its beauty every time she passed by. She knew every scratch on its surface, every key that needed the gentlest touch. During her late-night cleaning rounds, when the house was empty and silent, she would sometimes sit at the bench and let her fingers dance across the keys. Tonight was different, though. The crowd was larger than usual, and the conversations seemed louder. Margaret moved carefully between the guests, adjusting flower arrangements and clearing empty glasses. She wore her simple black uniform dress and comfortable shoes that let her work for hours without pain. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she kept her eyes down, focused on her tasks. The guests barely noticed her presence. They were too busy discussing their latest business deals, vacation homes, and expensive art purchases. Margaret had heard it all before. These monthly galas raised money for various charities, but she often wondered if the attendees cared more about being seen than actually helping others. She was adjusting the white roses near the piano when she heard a loud, mocking voice behind her. "Well, well, what do we have here?" Margaret turned to see Vincent Ashford III approaching with his usual group of friends. She recognized him immediately. He was hard to miss. Vincent was a real estate tycoon who owned half the commercial buildings in the city. He was tall, well-dressed, and carried himself like he owned the world. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and his expensive suit probably cost more than Margaret made in 3 months. But what made Vincent truly memorable was his personality. He was known for his cruel sense of humor and his belief that money made him better than everyone else. Margaret had seen him mock waiters, insult artists, and make fun of anyone he considered beneath his social status. "Our little cleaning lady seems fascinated by the piano," Vincent announced to his friends, his voice carrying across the nearby area. Several other guests turned to watch, sensing entertainment. Margaret felt her cheeks burn as attention focused on her. She tried to step away, but Vincent moved closer, blocking her path. "Tell me, sweetheart," he said, his tone dripping with fake kindness. "Do you even know what that instrument is called?" His friends chuckled, and Margaret could feel more eyes turning toward them. She wanted to disappear, but she was trapped between Vincent and the piano. "It's a piano, sir," she replied quietly, hoping he would lose interest and move on. "A piano?" Vincent laughed loudly. "She knows it's a piano, everyone. How educational." His friends joined in the laughter, and Margaret noticed phones being pulled out to record the interaction. "But can you play it?" Vincent continued, his eyes gleaming with malicious amusement. "I bet our little cleaning lady here couldn't even manage chopsticks without making it sound like a catfight." The crowd around them grew larger. Margaret could see curious faces pressing closer, eager to witness whatever drama Vincent was creating. She felt small and exposed under their stares. "I can play," she said softly, immediately regretting the words as soon as they left her mouth. The laughter that erupted was like a physical blow. Vincent's eyes widened with delight as he realized he had found an even better source of entertainment than he had hoped for. "She can play," he announced to the crowd. Did everyone hear that? "Our cleaning lady claims she can play the piano." More phones appeared, and Margaret realized this moment was being captured and would probably be shared on social media within minutes. The thought made her stomach turn. Vincent moved even closer, his voice becoming theatrically loud so everyone could hear clearly. "You know what, sweetheart? I'm feeling generous tonight. Very generous indeed." He paused for dramatic effect, making sure he had everyone's attention. "I'm going to give you a chance to prove yourself." Margaret's heart began racing. She could sense that whatever Vincent was about to propose would not end well for her. "Next month, at the November Gala, I want you to perform for us," Vincent declared. "But not just any little tune. If you're going to waste our time, it better be worth it. He turned to address the crowd, playing to his audience like an actor on stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, I hereby challenge our cleaning lady to perform Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, one of the most difficult pieces ever written for piano." The crowd murmured with surprise and anticipation. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. She knew that piece. She knew it very well. But the memories it brought back were both wonderful and painful. Vincent wasn't finished. He was enjoying himself too much to stop now. "And to make this interesting, I'm going to make a bet. A public bet." He grinned wickedly. "If she can actually perform that concerto, and I mean really perform it, not just bang on the keys, I will marry her on the spot." "Right here, in front of all of you." The crowd gasped and began talking excitedly among themselves. This was better entertainment than they had expected at a charity event. "But when she fails," Vincent continued, his voice turning cold, "and she will fail spectacularly. She will resign from her position here and never show her face at this estate again. She'll be gone, and we'll never have to see her embarrass herself like this again." Margaret stood frozen, unable to move or speak. The weight of hundreds of eyes pressed down on her, and the sound of excited chatter filled her ears. Someone was definitely live-streaming this now. She could see the telltale red recording lights on multiple phones. "So what do you say, cleaning lady?" Vincent asked, his voice mocking and confident. "Do you accept my generous challenge? Or are you going to admit right now that you were lying about being able to play?" Margaret looked around at the sea of faces surrounding her. Some looked amused, others seemed uncomfortable with Vincent's cruelty, but all of them were waiting for her response. She thought about her grandmother, about the countless hours they had spent together at an old upright piano in their tiny apartment. She thought about the dreams she had abandoned and the life she had built from the pieces. "I accept," she whispered. "What was that?" Vincent cupped his ear dramatically. "I couldn't hear you." "I accept your challenge," Margaret said louder, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. The crowd erupted in excited chatter and applause. Vincent's grin widened as he realized he had created the perfect spectacle. He was already imagining the social media buzz, the bets that would be placed, and the sweet moment when he would publicly humiliate this presumptuous cleaning woman who dared to claim she could play classical piano. "Excellent," he declared. "Ladies and gentlemen, mark your calendars. Next month's gala just became much more interesting." As the crowd began to disperse, people pulling out their phones to share the news, Margaret stood alone by the piano. Her reflection stared back at her from its polished surface, and for a moment, she saw not the tired cleaning woman in a simple uniform, but the young girl who had once believed music could take her anywhere. Vincent walked away with his friends, already discussing how they would publicize the event and take bets on the outcome. He was certain he had created the perfect entertainment, a delusional cleaning woman who would embarrass herself in front of the city's elite, providing him with weeks of amusing conversation. What Vincent didn't know was that Margaret Chen had secrets buried deep in her past. Secrets that included years of intensive classical training, competition victories, and a talent that had once been called extraordinary. He had no idea that his cruel joke had just awakened something that had been sleeping for far too long. As Margaret finally walked away from the piano that night, her mind was already racing toward the challenge ahead. She had 30 days to prepare for the performance of her lifetime, and she intended to give Vincent Ashford III a surprise he would never forget. Margaret's hands shook as she unlocked the door to her small apartment that night. The events at the gala kept replaying in her mind like a broken record. Vincent's mocking laughter, the sea of faces staring at her, the weight of the challenge she had just accepted. It all felt like a terrible dream. Her apartment was tiny but clean, with just enough space for a bed, a small kitchen, and a living area that doubled as her dining room. The walls were painted a soft cream color, and she had tried to make the space feel warm with a few plants and some second-hand furniture she had carefully chosen. But tonight, even her cozy home couldn't comfort her racing thoughts. She kicked off her work shoes and sat heavily on her small couch, burying her face in her hands. What had she done? Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 was one of the most challenging pieces in classical music. Professional pianists spent months preparing for such a performance, and she was just a cleaning lady who hadn't played seriously in years. Margaret stood up and walked to her bedroom closet, pushing aside her work uniforms and casual clothes until she reached the back corner. There, hidden behind everything else, was a dusty cardboard box she hadn't opened in over 2 years. Her heart pounded as she pulled it out and carried it to the living room. The box felt heavier than she remembered. She sat on the floor and slowly lifted the lid, as if she was opening a treasure chest from another lifetime. The first thing she saw was a photograph, and the sight of it made her breath catch in her throat. It was a picture of herself at 16 years old, standing beside a magnificent concert grand piano on the stage of Carnegie Hall. She was wearing a formal black dress with a pearl necklace, her hair styled in an elegant updo. But what struck her most was the confident smile on her young face, the look of someone who belonged on that stage, who had earned her place there through years of dedication and natural talent. Margaret picked up the photograph with trembling fingers. She remembered that night so clearly. It was the final round of the International Young Pianists competition, and she had just performed Chopin's Piano Concerto No. 1 to a standing ovation. The judges had called her performance extraordinary and mature beyond her years. She had won first place and a full scholarship to Juilliard, the most prestigious music school in the country. Underneath the photograph were newspaper clippings yellowed with age. "Local teen wins national piano competition," read one headline. "Young prodigy headed for Juilliard," announced another. Margaret had forgotten her mother had saved all of these articles. She read through them now, remembering the interviews, the excitement, the feeling that her whole life was stretching out before her like a golden road. At the bottom of the box was what she had really been looking for, her grandmother's sheet music collection. The pages were worn and soft from years of use, with handwritten notes in Chinese characters filling the margins. Her grandmother, Nai Nai, had been a concert pianist in Shanghai before moving to America in the 1960s. She had given up her own musical career to raise her family, but she had poured all of her knowledge and passion into teaching Margaret. Margaret pulled out the sheet music for Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, and a flood of memories washed over her. She could almost hear Nai Nai's voice, patient but demanding, guiding her through the complex passages. "Music is not just about hitting the right notes," Nai Nai would say in her accented English. "Music is about telling a story with your heart. The piano is just the messenger." Margaret had been 8 years old when Nai Nai first showed her this concerto. She remembered being intimidated by the dense pages covered with thousands of tiny notes. But Nai Nai had broken it down piece by piece, measure by measure, until Margaret understood not just how to play it, but what it meant. "This piece is about struggle and triumph," Nai Nai had explained. Rachmaninoff wrote it when he was very sad, when he thought he could never write music again. But then he found his strength, and this concerto was his way of saying, "I am still here. I am still alive." Margaret had mastered the piece by age 14 and had performed it several times in competitions. It had been her signature piece, the one that had earned her the most recognition and praise. But she hadn't touched it in over 7 years. She flipped through more photographs in the box. There was Nai Nai at her old upright piano in their tiny apartment above the family's laundromat. Margaret as a child, barely able to reach the pedals, practicing scales with intense concentration. Pictures from various competitions and recitals, always with Nai Nai beaming proudly in the background. Then the photographs changed. Margaret found pictures from when she was 17, and she could see the stress beginning to show in both their faces. That was when Nai Nai had started forgetting things. Small things at first, like where she had put her reading glasses or what she had eaten for breakfast. But then the forgetfulness grew worse. Margaret remembered the doctor's appointment where they had received the diagnosis: early onset dementia. The words had hit them like a physical blow. Nai Nai was only 68, still young enough to have many good years ahead of her. But the disease was progressing quickly. "We'll figure this out," Margaret had told her grandmother that day, holding her hand in the doctor's office. "We'll get through this together." But figuring it out had meant making impossible choices. Juilliard required full-time attendance and complete dedication. There were no exceptions, no part-time programs, no way to care for a grandmother with dementia while pursuing a professional music career. Margaret had deferred her admission for 1 year, hoping Nai's condition would stabilize or that they could find adequate care. Instead, things got worse. Nai began wandering away from home and forgetting Margaret's name. The specialized care facilities were expensive, far more than their family could afford. Margaret had to quit her part-time job at the music store to become her grandmother's full-time caregiver. She found more photographs now that told the story of those difficult years. Pictures of Nai in the hospital, looking small and confused in the white bed. Margaret at 18, 19, 20, looking increasingly tired as she balanced multiple jobs to pay for treatments and medication. The piano in their apartment, covered with a sheet because Nai could no longer bear to hear music. It confused and agitated her. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she remembered their last real conversation. Nai had been having a rare clear moment, sitting in her favorite chair by the window. "I ruined your dreams," Nai had whispered, her voice weak but lucid. "No, Nai," Margaret had protested. "You gave me everything. You taught me everything I know. Promise me something," Nai had said, gripping Margaret's hand with surprising strength. "Promise me you won't let the music die inside you. No matter what happens, don't let it die," Margaret had promised. But after Nai passed away 2 years later, she felt too old, too disconnected from the classical music world to return. She was 22 by then, and most of her former competitors were already graduating from prestigious programs and beginning their professional careers. She felt like she had missed her chance, like that part of her life was over forever. The caretaking job at Whitmore Estate had simply been a way to survive. It paid enough to cover her rent and basic expenses, and it was quiet work that didn't require her to interact with many people. She had convinced herself that she was content with this simple life, that she had made peace with her choices. But now, sitting on her living room floor surrounded by the remnants of her former life, Margaret realized that the music had never really died inside her. It had just been sleeping, waiting for someone like Vincent Ashford III to accidentally wake it up with his cruel challenge. She picked up the Rachmaninoff sheet music again and studied the opening measures. Her fingers began moving unconsciously, playing the notes in the air as she read through the score. Muscle memory was a powerful thing. She could still see exactly where her hands needed to be, still feel the rhythm and flow of the piece. For the first time since accepting Vincent's challenge, Margaret felt a spark of something other than fear. It was excitement mixed with determination and a growing sense of righteous anger. Vincent thought he was humiliating a simple cleaning lady, but he had no idea who he was really dealing with. Margaret carefully returned everything to the box except for the Rachmaninoff sheet music. She spread the pages out on her small dining table and really looked at them for the first time in years. Tomorrow she would need to find a way to practice. She would need to prepare for the performance of her lifetime. As she got ready for bed that night, Margaret caught sight of herself in the bathroom mirror. For just a moment, she saw not the tired cleaning woman who had been mocked at the gala, but the confident young pianist who had once owned the stage at Carnegie Hall. That girl was still there, hidden beneath years of struggle and compromise. Vincent Ashford III thought he had set up an easy victory for himself, a chance to publicly humiliate someone he considered beneath him. What he had actually done was give Margaret Chen a reason to reclaim everything she had lost, and 30 days to prepare for the comeback of a lifetime. Margaret woke up the next morning with a strange mix of excitement and terror running through her veins. The first thing she saw was the Rachmaninoff sheet music spread across her dining table, and the reality of what she had agreed to do hit her like a cold splash of water. She had exactly 29 days to prepare for what might be the most important performance of her life. At work that day, everything felt different. The Whitmore estate looked the same. Grand hallways, expensive artwork, and that magnificent piano sitting in the main hall like a sleeping giant. But now Margaret saw it differently. It wasn't just a piece of furniture to dust around anymore. It was her training ground, her secret weapon, her chance at redemption. The other staff members noticed nothing unusual about Margaret's behavior during the day. She cleaned the bathrooms, organized the library, and prepared for a small dinner party that evening. But inside, her mind was racing with plans and possibilities. The estate's schedule worked in her favor. The family who owned the mansion, the Whitmores, were traveling in Europe for the next month. The house was mostly empty except for the evening events, which usually ended by 10 o'clock. After that, Margaret often stayed late to finish cleaning, which meant she would have access to the piano when no one else was around. The dinner party that evening was smaller than the monthly galas, with only about 30 guests. Margaret served drinks and cleared plates, moving through the crowd like a ghost. But several people recognized her from the night before, and she could hear whispered conversations about Vincent's challenge. "Did you see the video online?" one woman asked her friend. "It already has 50,000 views." "Poor thing doesn't know what she's gotten herself into," another guest replied. "That piece is impossible for an amateur." Margaret kept her face neutral, but inside she felt a burning determination growing stronger. These people saw her as entertainment, a sad joke to laugh about over their expensive wine. They had no idea what was coming. When the last guest finally left at 9:30, Margaret began her usual cleaning routine. But tonight she worked faster than usual, eager to finish her duties and begin what really mattered. She cleaned the kitchen, organized the serving pieces, and made sure everything was perfect for the next day. At exactly 11 o'clock, Margaret walked into the main hall and approached the piano. The room was dark except for a few security lights, creating dramatic shadows across the polished floors. She turned on the small lamp that sat on top of the piano and carefully lifted the lid, revealing the beautiful ivory and ebony keys underneath. Margaret sat on the bench and placed her hands on the keys for the first time in years. The feel of the smooth surfaces under her fingertips brought back a flood of memories. She started with simple scales, just to wake up her muscles and remember the basic movements. Her fingers felt stiff and awkward at first. 7 years of cleaning and manual labor had changed her hands. They were stronger now, but less flexible. The calluses were in different places. Margaret realized this was going to be harder than she had hoped. She pulled out the first page of the Rachmaninoff Concerto and began working through the opening measures slowly, note by note. The music that had once flowed from her fingers like water now felt clunky and uncertain. Several times she had to stop and stretch her hands, which cramped up faster than they used to. But gradually, as the minutes passed, something magical began to happen. Her muscle memory started to awaken. Her fingers began to remember the patterns they had practiced thousands of times as a teenager. The music that had been sleeping inside her for so long began to stir back to life. Margaret practiced until 2 in the morning that first night, working through just the first movement of the concerto. When she finally stopped, her fingertips were sore and her back ached from sitting at the piano bench. But she felt more alive than she had in years. The next day at work, Margaret had trouble concentrating on her usual tasks. Her mind kept drifting to the piano, to the passages she needed to work on, to the feeling of the music flowing through her fingers again. She caught herself humming melodies while she cleaned, and had to stop herself when other staff members were around. During her lunch break, Margaret drove to the public library and used their computers to research Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. She found recordings by famous pianists, analysis of the piece's structure, and even video tutorials that broke down the most challenging sections. She printed out several articles and studied them like a student preparing for the most important exam of her life. That evening, word about Vincent's challenge had spread even further. Margaret overheard guests at dinner talking about placing bets on whether she would even show up to perform. The odds were heavily against her, which only fueled her determination. Her second night of practice went better than the first. Her fingers felt less stiff, and she was able to work through larger sections of the first movement without stopping. But she also realized just how much work lay ahead of her. The concerto was over 30 minutes long. with 3 complete movements full of complex passages, dramatic crescendos, and sections that required perfect coordination between both hands. By the end of her first week of secret practice, Margaret had developed a routine. She would work her regular shifts during the day, staying alert and professional. But as soon as the estate emptied out for the evening, she would transform into someone else entirely. She would sit at that piano and pour every ounce of energy and focus into bringing the music back to life. The physical challenges were significant. Margaret's fingertips began to crack and bleed from the intensive practice. She started wearing small bandages during the day, telling anyone who asked that she had cut herself while cleaning. Her back and shoulders ached constantly from hunching over the piano for hours each night, but the mental challenges were even harder. There were passages in the concerto that required a level of technical skill she wasn't sure she could reclaim. The second movement had a beautiful flowing melody that needed to be played with perfect emotional expression. The third movement was like an athletic event, requiring speed and precision that pushed even professional pianists to their limits. Margaret began staying later and later each night, sometimes not getting home until 3 or 4 in the morning. She would collapse into bed exhausted, only to wake up a few hours later for another day of work. The other cleaning staff started to comment on how tired she looked, but Margaret just blamed it on extra duties. During her second week of preparation, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. She remembered her old piano teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, who had coached her through many competitions as a teenager. Margaret hadn't spoken to her in over 7 years, but she decided to take a chance and reach out. She found Mrs. Rodriguez's contact information online and sent her a careful email, explaining who she was and asking if they could talk. To Margaret's surprise, her former teacher responded within hours, expressing joy at hearing from her and curiosity about what had happened to her promising career. When they finally spoke on the phone, Mrs. Rodriguez was shocked to learn about Margaret's grandmother's illness and the sacrifices she had made. But when Margaret explained about Vincent's challenge and her desperate need to prepare for the performance, her teacher didn't hesitate to offer help. "Your talent was never gone, Mia," Mrs. Rodriguez said, using the same affectionate term she had used when Margaret was young. "It was just sleeping, waiting for the right moment to wake up." They arranged to have video call sessions 3 times a week, where Mrs. Rodriguez would watch Margaret play and offer guidance on technique and interpretation. Having her teacher's support felt like a lifeline during the most challenging period of preparation. The news about Vincent's bet continued to spread throughout the city's social circles. Margaret discovered that people were actually selling tickets to the November Gala, treating it like a sporting event rather than a charity function. Social media was buzzing with speculation about whether the cleaning lady would even attempt to perform, or if she would back out at the last minute. Vincent himself was enjoying every moment of the attention. He gave interviews to local entertainment blogs, describing the challenge as a little fun and expressing his confidence that he would easily win the bet. He had already started planning how he would publicly fire Margaret when she failed, and was considering filming the whole event for his social media channels. What Vincent didn't know was that every night, alone in the darkened mansion he thought he understood so well, Margaret Chen was slowly but surely reclaiming her place as one of the most talented pianists the city had ever produced. Her fingers were growing stronger, her technique was sharpening, and most importantly, her confidence was building with each passing day. The music that had been silent for so long was finally ready to speak again, and it had something very important to say. The morning of the November Gala arrived with crisp autumn air and golden sunlight streaming through Margaret's small apartment windows. She had barely slept the night before, her mind racing between excitement and terror. Today was the day that would change everything, one way or another. Margaret sat at her kitchen table staring at a simple black dress hanging on her bedroom door. It wasn't fancy or expensive, just a dress her neighbor Helen had kindly loaned her when she heard about the performance. Helen was a retired school teacher who had always been kind to Margaret, and she had insisted that Margaret needed something special for such an important night. "You're going to show them what you're really made of," Helen had said with a warm smile. "I can see it in your eyes. You're not the same person who accepted that man's challenge a month ago." Helen was right. Over the past 4 weeks, Margaret had transformed herself through sheer determination and countless hours of practice. Her fingers were stronger now, her technique sharper, and most importantly, her confidence had grown with each passing day. The music that had been sleeping inside her for 7 years was finally awake and ready to speak. Margaret spent the morning doing light stretches and finger exercises, keeping her hands limber for the performance ahead. She ate a small breakfast, knowing that nerves might make it difficult to keep food down later. Then she sat at her dining table and reviewed the sheet music one final time, her eyes tracing the familiar patterns that her fingers now knew by heart. At noon, Margaret's phone rang. It was Mrs. Rodriguez, calling to offer final words of encouragement. "Remember, mija," her former teacher said, her voice warm and confident. "You were born to play this piece. Don't think about the audience or that terrible man who challenged you. Just play for yourself, for your grandmother, and for the music itself." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. Over the past month, Mrs. Rodriguez had become her lifeline, offering guidance and support through video calls and constant encouragement. Having her teacher believe in her again had made all the difference. Meanwhile, across town, the Whitmore estate was buzzing with unprecedented activity. The November gala had sold out completely, with tickets being resold online for 10 times their original price. News trucks were parked outside the mansion, and reporters were interviewing guests as they arrived for what was being called the social event of the decade. Vincent Ashford III stood in the main hall, adjusting his expensive tuxedo and checking his reflection in the polished surface of the piano. He had spent the morning giving interviews to local news stations, describing the evening as a little entertainment and expressing his complete confidence in the outcome. "I feel almost bad for the poor woman," he told one reporter with a smug smile. But she brought this on herself with her ridiculous claims. Sometimes people need to learn their place. The main hall had been transformed for the evening. Additional seating had been brought in to accommodate the larger crowd, and professional lighting had been installed to ensure every moment would be captured clearly for the cameras. Several local musicians were in attendance, curious to witness what they expected to be a spectacular failure. Vincent's friends gathered around him near the piano, placing final bets and making jokes about Margaret's impending humiliation. They had already planned their celebration dinner for after the performance, confident that they would be toasting Vincent's victory within the hour. "Has anyone actually seen her today?" asked one of Vincent's companions. "Maybe she got smart and decided not to show up." Vincent checked his expensive watch. It was 7:30, and the performance was scheduled to begin at 8 o'clock sharp. Margaret was nowhere to be seen, and for a brief moment he wondered if she really might have backed out at the last minute. Back at her apartment, Margaret was getting dressed slowly and carefully. The black dress fit her perfectly, and she had pulled her hair back in a simple but elegant style. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw something she hadn't seen in years, a woman who belonged on stage, who had earned her place there through talent and dedication. She gathered her small purse and the sheet music, even though she knew every note by heart. As she was about to leave, she noticed the framed photograph from Carnegie Hall sitting on her dresser. She picked it up and looked at the confident 16-year-old girl smiling back at her. "This is for you, Nai," she whispered to the photo, "and for everyone who tried to make me forget who I really am." Margaret arrived at the Whitmore estate at exactly 7:45. The parking lot was completely full, with cars lined up along the street for several blocks. She could see camera crews and reporters positioned around the entrance, and her stomach tightened with nerves. But as she walked toward the mansion, something remarkable happened. Margaret felt her shoulders straighten and her chin lift. She wasn't sneaking in through the service entrance tonight like she had hundreds of times before. Tonight she was walking through the front door as a performer, as an artist, as someone who belonged there. Inside the mansion, the main hall was packed with people. Every seat was filled, and dozens more guests stood along the walls and in the doorways. The buzz of excited conversation filled the air, and Margaret could feel hundreds of eyes turning toward her as she entered. Vincent stood near the piano, surrounded by his usual group of friends. When he spotted Margaret walking across the marble floor, his confident smirk began to waver slightly. There was something different about her tonight, the way she carried herself. The calm focus in her eyes, the sense of purpose in her every step. Well, Vincent announced loudly, his voice carrying across the room. Our little cleaning lady has actually shown up. I was beginning to think you had come to your senses and decided to save yourself the embarrassment. The crowd turned to watch the interaction, phones already recording every moment. Margaret walked directly to Vincent, her expression calm and composed. I keep my promises, she said simply, her voice steady and clear. Vincent's friends chuckled, but the laughter seemed forced now. There was something unsettling about Margaret's confidence, something that suggested this might not go exactly as they had planned. Very well, then, Vincent declared, gesturing dramatically toward the piano. Let's get this over with. I have dinner reservations to keep. Margaret approached the piano bench and paused for a moment, her hand resting on the polished wood. This was the same instrument she had practiced on every night for the past month, the same keys she had poured her heart into during countless hours of preparation. But tonight felt different. Tonight she wasn't practicing anymore. Tonight was the real thing. She adjusted the bench with practiced precision, exactly the way Mrs. Rodriguez had taught her years ago. She sat down and placed her hands on the keys, feeling their familiar weight and texture beneath her fingertips. The room had grown completely silent, hundreds of people holding their breath in anticipation. Vincent stood beside the piano, his arms crossed and his expression smugly confident. He was already imagining the moment when Margaret would stumble through a few notes and give up in embarrassment. He could practically taste his victory. But as Margaret sat at the piano, something extraordinary was happening. All the nerves and fear that had been building inside her for weeks suddenly melted away. She felt her grandmother's presence beside her, guiding her hands and filling her heart with courage. She heard Mrs. Rodriguez's voice reminding her that she was born to play this music. Most importantly, she felt the music itself waiting inside her like a caged bird ready to fly. Margaret took a deep breath and looked out at the sea of faces staring back at her. Some looked curious, others skeptical, and many seemed to be waiting for entertainment at her expense. But she also saw a few faces that looked encouraging. Helen from her apartment building, a couple of the younger staff members from the estate, and even some guests who seemed genuinely interested in hearing her play. She turned back to the piano and placed her fingers on the keys for the opening chord of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. For just a moment, the weight of everything, Vincent's cruel challenge, the months of secret practice, the years of buried dreams, pressed down on her shoulders. Then Margaret pressed the keys, and the first notes of the concerto filled the air like the sound of destiny itself awakening. Vincent's confident smirk began to fade as he realized that something was very, very different about the way Margaret was approaching the piano. This wasn't the hesitant fumbling of an amateur. This was the confident posture and precise technique of someone who actually knew what they were doing. The audience fell completely silent as Margaret continued into the opening passage, her fingers moving across the keys with growing confidence and grace. Professional musicians in the crowd began to sit up straighter, recognizing immediately that they were witnessing something far beyond what anyone had expected. Margaret's performance was about to begin in earnest, and Vincent Ashford III was about to learn that sometimes, when you mock someone and try to humiliate them, you might accidentally wake up something far more powerful than you ever imagined possible. The first notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 emerged from the piano like gentle raindrops, soft and delicate, building slowly into something much more powerful. Margaret's fingers moved across the keys with a precision that made several professional musicians in the audience lean forward in their seats. This was not what anyone had expected. Vincent's smug expression began to shift as he realized that Margaret wasn't struggling or fumbling with the opening measures. Her posture was perfect, her hand position exactly right, and the music flowing from the piano sounded clean and confident. A small knot of worry formed in his stomach, but he pushed it away. She had barely started. Surely she would make mistakes as the piece got more difficult. Margaret felt herself settling into the performance like slipping into warm water. All the hours of secret practice, all the muscle memory she had rebuilt over the past month, came together in this moment. Her grandmother's voice seemed to whisper in her ear, guiding her through the familiar passages that had once been as natural as breathing. The first movement of the concerto began with a haunting melody that spoke of longing and sadness. Margaret's fingers danced across the keys, bringing out every nuance of emotion that Rachmaninoff had woven into the music. The audience, which had been chattering and shifting in their seats just moments before, fell completely silent. Mrs. Chen, Margaret's elderly neighbor who had somehow managed to get a ticket, sat in the back row with tears already forming in her eyes. She had heard Margaret practicing late at night through their thin apartment walls, but she had never imagined her young neighbor could play with such beauty and skill. As Margaret moved into the more complex sections of the first movement, her confidence grew with each passing measure. Her left hand provided a steady foundation of deep, resonant bass notes, while her right hand soared through the intricate melodies. The coordination between her hands was flawless, the result of countless hours of careful practice. Vincent shifted uncomfortably beside the piano. This was definitely not going according to his plan. Margaret wasn't just playing the notes correctly. She was interpreting the music with the kind of emotional depth that took years to develop. Where had a cleaning lady learned to play like this? The first movement built to its dramatic climax, with Margaret's hands flying across the entire length of the keyboard. The music filled every corner of the mansion, transforming the space from a wealthy person's home into a concert hall. Guests who had come expecting to witness a humiliation found themselves transported by the sheer beauty of what they were hearing. Several people in the audience began recording on their phones, not to capture Margaret's failure, but to preserve what they were beginning to realize was an extraordinary performance. The professional musicians present exchanged amazed glances, recognizing immediately that they were witnessing something special. Margaret finished the first movement with a series of powerful chords that seemed to hang in the air long after the sound had faded. She paused for just a moment, her hands resting on the keys, before moving into the second movement without breaking the spell she had cast over the room. The second movement was completely different from the first, softer, more intimate, like a gentle conversation between old friends. Margaret's touch became lighter, more delicate, drawing out the sweet melancholy that made this concerto so beloved by audiences around the world. Her face was peaceful and focused, completely absorbed in the music. Vincent's friends began to look at each other with growing concern. This was supposed to be entertainment at Margaret's expense, but instead they found themselves genuinely moved by her performance. Several of them had attended concerts by world-famous pianists, and Margaret's playing was easily at that level. In the middle of the second movement, Margaret encountered a passage that had given her trouble during her practice sessions, a series of rapid, flowing notes that needed to be played with perfect evenness and expression. For just a moment, her heart skipped as she approached the challenging section. Then she remembered her grandmother's words from years ago. "Don't think about the difficult parts. Just let the music carry you forward." Margaret relaxed into the passage, and her fingers found their way through the complex runs as if they had been playing this piece every day for the past 7 years. The audience was now completely under Margaret's spell. Conversations had stopped entirely, and even the staff members who were supposed to be working had gathered in the doorways to listen. The music seemed to touch something deep inside everyone present, reminding them of dreams they had forgotten and emotions they had buried. Mrs. Rodriguez watched the performance through her laptop screen, connected via video call from her home across town. She had tears streaming down her face as she watched her former student reclaim her place as one of the most gifted pianists she had ever taught. Margaret was playing with even more emotional maturity than she had shown as a teenager. As the second movement drew to its gentle close, Margaret felt a sense of complete rightness, as if this was exactly where she was meant to be at this moment in her life. All the years of struggle, all the sacrifices she had made, had led to this performance. She was no longer playing to prove anything to Vincent or to win a bet. She was playing because this was who she truly was. The third movement began with a dramatic flourish that made several audience members actually gasp out loud. This was the most technically demanding part of the entire concerto, requiring speed, precision, and stamina that pushed even professional pianists to their limits. Margaret's hands moved across the keyboard like lightning, playing passages so complex they seemed almost impossible. Vincent's face had gone completely pale. He was standing rigid beside the piano, watching Margaret's hands fly across the keys with growing horror. This wasn't just good playing. This was virtuoso-level performance that belonged in the world's greatest concert halls. How is this possible? The music built to incredible heights of intensity, with Margaret's entire body involved in bringing the concerto to life. Her shoulders swayed with the rhythm. Her face showed the joy and passion she felt in the music, and her hands seemed to know exactly where every note needed to be without conscious thought. Some of the younger guests began openly crying, overwhelmed by the beauty and power of what they were witnessing. Others sat in stunned silence, trying to process how completely wrong they had been about Margaret. This wasn't a cleaning lady pretending to play piano. This was an artist of the highest caliber sharing her gift with the world. The final section of the concerto approached like an unstoppable force of nature. Margaret's hands raced across the keys in passages that seemed to defy human capability, building to the thunderous climax that would bring the entire 30-minute journey to its conclusion. Vincent realized with growing panic that Margaret was actually going to complete the entire concerto flawlessly. More than that, she was giving a performance that would be talked about for years to come. His cruel joke had backfired spectacularly, and now he was trapped by his own words in front of hundreds of witnesses and multiple cameras. Margaret reached the final section of the concerto, where all the themes and melodies came together in a magnificent conclusion. Her hands moved with absolute certainty across the keys, playing the complex final passages with the kind of authority that could only come from years of dedication and natural talent. The music built to its ultimate climax, with Margaret playing chords so powerful they seemed to shake the very foundations of the mansion. Every person in the room was on the edge of their seat, carried along by the incredible journey Margaret had taken them on through Rachmaninoff's masterpiece. Then, with a final series of triumphant chords that rang out like cathedral bells, Margaret brought the concerto to its conclusion. Her hands lifted from the keys, and for a moment the silence was absolute. No one moved, no one breathed, as the last note seemed to echo through the air like a benediction. Margaret sat perfectly still at the piano bench, her hands folded in her lap, her head slightly bowed. She had just given the performance of her lifetime, pouring 7 years of buried dreams and suppressed talent into 30 minutes of pure musical magic. She felt empty and full at the same time, exhausted and energized, as if she had just run a marathon and won. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few seconds. Then, somewhere in the back of the room, someone began to clap. The sound was joined by another pair of hands, then another, until the entire room erupted in thunderous applause that seemed to go on forever. People leaped to their feet, shouting and cheering as if they had just witnessed a miracle. Many were openly weeping, overwhelmed by the beauty and emotion of Margaret's performance. The professional musicians in the audience applauded with particular enthusiasm, recognizing that they had just heard one of the finest performances of this challenging concerto they had ever experienced. Margaret slowly stood up from the piano bench and turned to face the audience. The sight of hundreds of people on their feet, clapping and cheering for her, felt like stepping into a dream she had thought was lost forever. This was the moment she had been born for, the moment all her years of training and sacrifice had been leading toward. The thunderous applause continued for what felt like forever. Margaret stood beside the piano, her heart pounding with a mixture of exhaustion and pure joy. She had done it. She had actually done it. After 7 years of silence, she had reclaimed her voice as a musician in the most spectacular way possible. Vincent Ashford III stood frozen in place, his expensive tuxedo suddenly feeling like a costume for a role he no longer wanted to play. His face had gone from its usual confident smirk to a sickly pale color that matched his growing panic. The reality of what had just happened was slowly sinking in, and it was far worse than his worst nightmare. The crowd continued to cheer and applaud, many people wiping tears from their eyes. Several professional musicians pushed their way toward the front, eager to congratulate Margaret and ask her about her background. The energy in the room was electric, buzzing with excitement and amazement at what everyone had just witnessed. Margaret's neighbor, Mrs. Chen, was crying openly in the back row, clapping so hard her hands hurt. She had known Margaret was special, but she had never imagined her quiet young neighbor possessed this level of extraordinary talent. Around her, other audience members were shaking their heads in disbelief, talking excitedly about the performance they had just heard. But the person Margaret was looking at was Vincent. She could see the fear and desperation growing in his eyes as he realized that his cruel joke had completely backfired. For a month, he had enjoyed telling people about his bet, confident that he would humiliate a simple cleaning lady and provide entertainment for his wealthy friends. Now he was trapped by his own words in front of hundreds of witnesses. The applause finally began to die down, and an expectant hush fell over the crowd. Everyone knew what was supposed to happen next. Vincent had made a public promise, recorded on dozens of phones and broadcast live on social media. The bet had been clear and specific, and Margaret had fulfilled her part flawlessly. Margaret walked slowly toward Vincent, her head held high and her expression calm. She had been thinking about this moment for weeks, imagining what she would say and do when the time came. But now that it was here, she felt surprisingly peaceful. The music had washed away her anger and replaced it with something much more powerful, a sense of her own worth and dignity. "Vincent," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "I performed your piece." Vincent's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. He looked around desperately at his friends, hoping for some way out of the situation he had created. But their faces showed only shock and embarrassment. They had been part of his cruel joke, and now they were all paying the price for their arrogance. The crowd began to murmur with anticipation. Phones were held high, recording every moment of what was clearly going to be a historic confrontation. Several reporters pushed closer, their cameras trained on Vincent's increasingly desperate face. I, Vincent stammered, his usual smooth confidence completely gone. "How did you honor the bet?" someone shouted from the crowd. The call was immediately taken up by others. "Honor the bet! Honor the bet!" The chant grew louder and more insistent, echoing through the mansion's grand halls. Margaret raised her hand, and the crowd fell silent again. Everyone leaned forward, eager to hear what she would say next. This was the moment they had all been waiting for. The moment when Vincent would have to face the consequences of his cruelty. "You're right," Margaret said, looking directly into Vincent's eyes. "You made a promise in front of all these people. You said if I could perform Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, you would marry me on the spot." Vincent's face went even paler, if that was possible. Sweat was beginning to form on his forehead despite the cool temperature in the mansion. He could hear the crowd behind him waiting to see if he would try to back out of his public commitment. Margaret took a step closer to Vincent, and he actually flinched backward. But instead of the anger or triumph he expected to see in her face, there was something else entirely. Pity, mixed with a quiet strength that made her seem 10 feet tall. "But Vincent," Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger, "I need to tell you something very important. Something that might surprise you." The crowd held its breath. This wasn't going the way anyone had expected. "I wouldn't marry you if you were the last man on earth," Margaret said clearly, her words carrying to every corner of the room. "Because you see, some things in this world are worth more than money. Things like dignity, respect, kindness, and real love. Things you clearly don't understand." A gasp went through the crowd, followed by scattered applause that quickly grew into another wave of cheering. This was even better than anyone had hoped for. Not only had Margaret proven Vincent wrong about her abilities, but she was also rejecting him publicly, turning his own cruel game against him. Vincent's face cycled through several different expressions. Relief that he wouldn't have to marry her, humiliation at being rejected so publicly, and growing anger at being made to look like a fool. His carefully constructed image as a powerful, untouchable tycoon was crumbling in real time. "You think you're so smart," Vincent snarled, his mask finally slipping completely. "You think this little performance makes you special? You're still just a cleaning lady. You'll always be just a cleaning lady." But his words fell flat in the face of what everyone had just witnessed. Margaret's performance had revealed the truth about who she really was, and no amount of Vincent's bluster could change that reality. "You're wrong about that, too," Margaret replied calmly. "I was never just a cleaning lady. I was a pianist who took a job cleaning to survive. But thanks to your challenge, I've remembered who I really am." She turned to address the crowd, speaking to all the people who had witnessed her transformation. "For 7 years, I let the world convince me that my dreams were over. I let circumstances make me forget my own worth. But tonight, thanks to this man's cruelty, I found my way back to the music that was always meant to be my life." The audience erupted in applause again. But Margaret wasn't finished. "Vincent thought he was humiliating me, but instead he gave me the greatest gift possible. The chance to remember that our worth isn't determined by our job title or our bank account. It's determined by who we are inside, by how we treat others, and by whether we have the courage to pursue our dreams." By now, several people in the crowd were recording Margaret's speech on their phones. Her words were already being shared online, spreading far beyond the walls of the Whitmore estate. Within hours, her story would be known around the world. Vincent tried one more time to regain control of the situation. "This is ridiculous," he announced loudly. "I'm not going to stand here and be lectured by the help." But his words only made him look worse. The crowd turned on him with a mixture of boos and angry comments. Someone shouted, "Show some respect," while another voice called out, "You got exactly what you deserved." Margaret's phone had already started buzzing with notifications. The video of her performance was going viral on social media, with millions of views and thousands of comments from people around the world who were amazed by her story and her incredible talent. Within the next hour, Margaret would receive messages from concert halls wanting to book her for performances, recording companies interested in producing an album, and music schools offering her teaching positions. The life she had thought was lost forever was suddenly opening up before her like a flower blooming in spring. But the most meaningful moment came when Mrs. Rodriguez, her former teacher, finally reached her by phone. Margaret stepped away from the crowd to take the call, and she could hear the joy and pride in her teacher's voice. "I knew you still had it in you, mija," Mrs. Rodriguez said through happy tears. "Your grandmother would be so proud. You didn't just play that concerto tonight, you lived it." Vincent, meanwhile, had become a social pariah in the span of a single evening. Videos of his cruel behavior and embarrassing defeat were already trending on multiple platforms. His business associates began distancing themselves from him, and his social circle suddenly found reasons to avoid his calls. The Whitmore family, who owned the estate, were so embarrassed by the incident that they immediately fired Vincent from their board of directors and banned him from future events. They also announced that they were donating the Steinway piano to Margaret's newly formed foundation for working-class musicians. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Margaret found herself surrounded by well-wishers and new opportunities. But the moment that meant the most to her was when she sat alone at the piano one last time, playing a simple melody her grandmother had taught her years ago. She thought about Nai, about all the sacrifices they had both made, and about the winding path that had led her back to this moment. Sometimes life took you on detours that seemed like dead ends. But if you held on to hope and stayed true to who you were inside, those detours could lead you exactly where you needed to be. Margaret Chen had walked into the Whitmore estate that evening as a cleaning lady facing a cruel challenge. She was leaving as a world-renowned pianist with a second chance at the career of her dreams.